Naledi never expected that an ordinary Tuesday would change the direction of her life. It was one of those quiet afternoons where everything felt predictable. Work had been steady, the weather was calm, and her mind was focused on nothing more than getting through the day and going home to rest. She had always been that kind of a woman, simple, grounded, content with the little things. She believed in love, not the dramatic kind you see in the movies, but the steady kind, the kind that grows slowly, the kind that feels safe. That afternoon, her office building was unusually busy. People moved in and out of the elevators, voices echoing softly through the hallway. Naledi stepped out of the lift, balancing a phone in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, and that was the very moment she saw him. He stood near the reception desk, speaking quietly with the security guard. Tall, well-dressed, calm in a way that felt different from everyone else around him. There was something about him that made her pause. Not because he was the most handsome man she had ever seen, but because there was a stillness about him, a quiet strength, the kind that made you curious even before you knew why. Their eyes met for only a second, just 1 second. But in that brief moment, she noticed something unexpected: sadness. It was hidden well, buried beneath composure and politeness, but it was there. And Naledi, being the kind of person who paid attention to people's emotions, felt it immediately. She looked away quickly, slightly embarrassed for staring. She told herself it was nothing, just another stranger passing through her day. But life has a strange way of introducing people to us, long before we understand their purpose. Later that afternoon, Naledi returned to the reception area to collect her package. As she signed the delivery form, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Excuse me, do you know where the finance department is?" She turned around. It was him, up close. His presence felt even stronger. Not intimidating, not overwhelming, just steady. For a moment, she forgot what he had asked. Then she smiled politely and pointed down the corridor. "Second door on the left," she said. He nodded, grateful, respectful. "Thank you," he replied. His voice was deep but gentle, the kind of voice that made people feel safe without trying too hard. As he walked away, Naledi felt something she couldn't quite explain. Not excitement, not attraction, not yet, just curiosity. A quiet feeling in her chest that whispered, "Pay attention." Because sometimes the people who enter our lives softly are the ones who change us the most. I just want to take a moment to appreciate you for being here and listening to this story with me. And I'm curious, have you ever met someone who made an impression on you from the very first moment, even before you understood why? If that has ever happened to you, I'd really love to hear your story. Tell me your name and let me know where you're watching from in the comment section. Naledi didn't think much about the encounter at first. Life moved on as it always did. Emails needed answering, deadlines needed meeting, bills needed paying. But somehow, that quiet stranger stayed in the back of her mind. Not loudly, not in a way that distracted her, just a gentle memory that surfaced every now and then. A few days later, she saw him again. This time, it wasn't in passing. She was standing in the building cafeteria during her lunch break, carefully stirring sugar into her tea, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" She looked up, and there he was, standing politely, holding a tray, waiting for her response. For a brief second, her heart skipped, not because she was nervous, but because something about the moment felt unexpectedly familiar. She glanced around the crowded room, then back at him. "No, it's not taken," she replied softly. He smiled, a small, respectful smile that didn't demand attention, and he sat down. There was a short silence between them, the kind that feels slightly awkward but not uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke. "I realized I never introduced myself the other day," he said. "My name is Kabelo." "I'm Naledi," she replied. And just like that, two strangers became acquaintances. Their conversation started simply. They spoke about work, about the long hours, about the unpredictable weather, about the small frustrations that everyone understands. Nothing deep, nothing personal, but there was an ease between them that felt natural. Kabelo listened carefully when she spoke. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush the conversation. He paid attention. And in a world where so many people were distracted, that kind of attention felt rare. Over the next few weeks, their paths continued to cross. Sometimes in the elevator, sometimes in the cafeteria, sometimes in the parking lot after work. Each encounter lasted only a few minutes, but each time the conversations became a little warmer, a little longer, a little more comfortable. Slowly, a quiet friendship began to form. Naledi found herself looking forward to those moments, not because she was searching for romance, but because his presence felt calm, safe. There was a steadiness about him that made her feel at ease, and yet there were also moments when she noticed something else, something subtle, something hidden, something in the middle of a conversation. His expression would change just for a second. His eyes would grow distant. His smile would fade slightly, as if his mind had suddenly traveled somewhere painful. Then, just as quickly, he would return to the present, smiling again, listening again, acting as though nothing had happened. Naledi noticed it more than once, but she never asked about it. Not yet, because she understood something important about people. Everyone carries a story, and some stories are too heavy to share too soon. One Friday afternoon, as they walked out of the building together, Kabelo turned to her and spoke in a tone that felt slightly more personal than usual. "Would you like to have coffee sometime?" The question caught her off guard, not because she hadn't expected it, but because it arrived gently, without pressure, without assumptions, just a simple invitation. Naledi paused for a moment, considering the request. She didn't feel afraid. She didn't feel uncertain. She felt curious. Curious about the man who spoke softly. Curious about the sadness she sometimes saw in his eyes. Curious about the story he had not yet told. So she smiled and nodded. "Yes," she said. And in that quiet moment, a new chapter of her life began to unfold. Because sometimes relationships don't start with fireworks. They start with small conversations, gentle invitations, and a simple decision to say yes. I want to pause here for a moment. And first, I just want to thank you for taking the time to listen and be part of this story with me. Your presence here truly means a lot. Now, I'd love to ask you something. Have you ever found yourself slowly growing closer to someone, not because you planned it, but because their presence simply felt peaceful and safe? If this has happened in your life, I invite you to share your experience. Tell me your name and let me know where you're watching from. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you in the comment section. The coffee meeting was simple. No grand setup, no romantic atmosphere, just a quiet cafe not too far from their office building. Naledi arrived a few minutes early. She chose a table by the window where soft afternoon light filtered through the glass, the kind of light that made everything feel calm, unhurried. She wasn't nervous, but she was aware that something about this moment felt different from the usual conversations they had shared in passing. When Kabelo walked in, he spotted her almost immediately, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something new in his expression. Not sadness, not distant, but a quiet warmth. He walked over and greeted her with a gentle smile. "I hope I didn't keep you waiting," he said. "Not at all," Naledi replied. They ordered coffee, sat down, and for a while their conversation followed the same familiar rhythm. Work, daily routines, light laughter, but something had shifted. There was more space now, more openness, as if both of them slightly understood that this was no longer just a passing interaction. At some point, the conversation slowed, a natural pause, and in that stillness, Naledi decided to ask something she had been holding back. She didn't rush it. She didn't force it. She simply spoke. "You seem like someone who carries a lot," she said softly. Kabelo looked at her. Not startled, not defensive, just still. For a brief moment, he didn't respond. His fingers wrapped gently around his cup, as if grounding himself in the present. Then he let out a quick breath. "I didn't realize it was that obvious," he said. Naledi gave a small smile. "It's not obvious to everyone," she replied, "but I notice things." He nodded slowly, and then for the very first time, he allowed the silence to stretch without trying to fill it. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, more honest. "I've just been through a lot," he said. He didn't go into details, not yet, but the weight of his words was enough. Naledi didn't push. She didn't ask questions that would force him to open up faster than he was ready. Instead, she did something simple, something powerful. She listened, really listened. And in that moment, Kabelo felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Safety. Not the kind that comes from having everything figured out, but the kind that comes from being seen without being judged. Their conversation shifted after that. It became quieter, more intentional, less about what they did and more about who they were. Kabelo shared small pieces of himself, not the full story, but enough for Naledi to understand one thing clearly. He had learned how to survive, but he had not yet learned how to heal. As the afternoon came to an end, they stepped outside together. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and orange. For a moment, they stood there in silence, not awkward, not uncertain, just present. Then Kabelo spoke. "Thank you for today," he said. Naledi tilted her head slightly. "For coffee?" she asked gently. He shook his head. "For seeing me," he replied. Those words stayed with her long after they had gone their separate ways. Because Naledi understood something that Kabelo himself did not yet fully realize. Some people don't just need love. They need to be reminded that they are worth loving. And sometimes God places people in our lives not just to receive love, but to become a mirror of it. I want to pause here for a moment and just say thank you again for being a part of this journey. Your time, your attention, it truly means more than you know. And I want to ask you something from the heart. Have you ever met someone who didn't need advice, didn't need fixing, but simply needed to be seen and understood? If you have, I'd love to hear your story. Tell me your name and where you're watching from in the comment section. After that afternoon, something shifted between Naledi and Kabelo. Not in a loud or obvious way, but in a quiet, spiritual way. Their conversations began to carry more weight, less surface, more substance. They still met casually, sometimes for coffee, sometimes walking out of the building together. But now, there were moments where silence spoke louder than words. Naledi began to notice something else about Kabelo. He was strong but tired. Not physically, soul tired. The kind of tiredness that doesn't go away with rest, because it comes from carrying things that were never properly released. One evening, as they sat on a bench outside the office building, watching the day fade into the night, Naledi felt it again, that quiet nudge in her spirit, the kind she had learned not to ignore. She turned to him gently. "Kabelo, can I ask you something?" she said. He nodded. "Do you pray?" The question hung softly in the air, not heavy, not forced, just present. Kabelo gave a small, almost uncertain smile. "Not as much as I used to," he admitted. Naledi studied his face for a moment. There was no shame in his answer, just honesty. "What changed?" she asked quietly. He exhaled slowly, and for the first time, he didn't try to hide. "Life," he said, just one word, but it carried years inside it. Naledi didn't rush to respond because she understood something deeply. When someone has been hurt, they don't always walk away from God in rebellion. Sometimes they drift slowly, quietly, until distance feels normal. "I understand," she said softly, and she meant it. There was a pause. Then she spoke again, her voice calm but firm. "You know, God hasn't moved, right?" Kabelo looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not resistance, but recognition. "He is still right where you left him," she continued gently. "Still listening, still present, still waiting." Kabelo didn't respond immediately. His eyes dropped for a moment, as if those words had reached somewhere deeper than he expected. For a brief second, Naledi saw it again, that sadness. But this time it wasn't hidden. It was closer to the surface. "I wouldn't even know what to say anymore," he admitted. Naledi smiled softly. "You don't have to have the perfect words," she said. "God isn't looking for performance. He's looking for honesty." There was something about the way she said it. Simple, true, uncomplicated. And for a moment, Kabelo felt something shift inside him. Not a complete breakthrough, not healing, but a crack, a small opening. Later that night, Naledi found herself thinking about him more deeply than before. Not in a romantic way, but in a spiritual way. She realized something that made her pause. Kabelo wasn't just a man she had met by chance. He was an assignment. Not to fix him, not to save him, but to stand in the gap where he had grown weak. To remind him of the God he had quietly drifted away from. And yet, as the realization settled in her heart, so did something else. A warning. Because she also understood something just as important. You can pour into someone and still lose yourself if you are not careful. The next few days revealed more. Kabelo began opening up in pieces, fragments of his story, moments of disappointment, betrayal, silent struggles he had never fully processed. He spoke about trusting people who had let him down, about prayers that felt like they were unanswered, about trying to stay strong for everyone else while quietly falling apart inside. Naledi listened, encouraged him, prayed for him, even when he didn't know she was praying. But slowly, very slowly, the imbalance began to show. She was pouring, he was receiving. She was lifting, he was leaning. And while that didn't feel wrong at first, it began to feel heavy. One afternoon, they had planned to meet. Kabelo didn't show up. No message, no explanation. Naledi sat there, waiting longer than she expected to. Not angry, just unsettled. When he finally called later that evening, his voice sounded distant. "I'm sorry," he said. "I just had a lot going on." Naledi accepted the apology, but something in her spirit stirred again. That same quiet voice, the one that whispers truth, even when your heart wants to ignore it. This was no longer just about connection. This was about capacity, because loving someone who is still broken requires strength. It requires spiritual strength. It requires discernment and boundaries. And Naledi was beginning to realize something she could not ignore anymore. Kabelo didn't just need love. He needed healing. And if he didn't face that, she could end up carrying a weight that was never meant to be hers. I want to pause here for a moment and just thank you again for being part of this story. Your presence here truly matters, and I want to ask you something honestly. Have you ever found yourself pouring into someone, encouraging them, supporting them, lifting them up, only to realize that they were not in a place to pour back into you? If you've ever experienced that, I'd love to hear your story. Tell me your name and where you're watching from in the comment section. Naledi began to feel it more clearly now. Not confusion, not doubt, but clarity. The kind that doesn't shout, but settles quietly in your spirit until you can no longer ignore it. Something wasn't balanced, and deep down she knew it. It wasn't that Kabelo was a bad person. He wasn't. He was kind. He was respectful, gentle in many ways, but he was also wounded. And wounds that are not healed have a way of affecting everything around them, even the people who come with good intentions. Over time, Naledi noticed a pattern. Kabelo would open up deeply one day, then withdraw the next. He would speak about wanting to do better, wanting to pray again, wanting to reconnect with God, but when it came time to take those steps, he hesitated, he delayed, he pulled back. It wasn't resistance, it was fear. Fear of confronting the parts of himself he had buried for so long. And Naledi, without realizing it, had started caring more than she should. She prayed for him constantly, encouraged him, checked on him, reminded him of who he could become. But slowly, she began to feel tired too. Not physically, but spiritually. One evening, after another conversation where Kabelo sounded distant again, Naledi sat alone in a room. The lights were dim, the world was quiet, and for the first time, she stopped focusing on him and turned her attention fully to God. "Lord, what is this?" she whispered, not out of frustration, but out of sincerity. She wasn't trying to control the situation. She just wanted understanding. And in that stillness, she felt it. That familiar peace, followed by a gentle but firm truth in her spirit. You cannot heal what someone is not willing to face. Naledi closed her eyes, letting those words settle deep within her, because they didn't come with condemnation. They came with clarity. She realized something in that moment that shifted everything. Her role was never to carry Kabelo. Her role was to point him back to God. Nothing more, nothing less. The next time they met, something was different. Not in tension, but in posture. Naledi was still kind, still warm, but she no longer overextended herself. There was a quiet strength about her now, a boundary that didn't need to be announced, but could be felt. As they sat together, Kabelo noticed it. "You seem different," he said. Naledi smiled softly. "I'm just learning to stay where God has placed me," she replied. He looked at her, trying to understand. "What does that mean?" he asked. She paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "It means I care about you," she said gently, "but I can't walk your journey for you." The words were soft, but they carried weight. Kabelo looked down, and for once, he didn't have a response ready. But deep down, he knew she was right. There was a long silence between them, not awkward, not tense, but honest. "I've been trying," he said finally. Naledi nodded. "I know," she replied, "and trying is a good place to start. But healing requires more than intention. It requires surrender." Those words stayed with him. You could see it in the way his expression changed, in the way his usual composure softened. For the first time, Kabelo wasn't being comforted. He was being confronted. Not harshly, but truthfully. And sometimes truth is the beginning of healing. Over the next few days, something subtle began to shift. Kabelo became quieter, more reflective. He didn't reach out as often, but when he did, there was intention behind it. One evening, he sent a simple message. "I prayed today." Naledi read it and smiled, not because everything had changed, but because something had begun. A seed, small, fragile, but real. And yet Naledi also understood something clearly now. Progress did not mean completion. Growth did not mean readiness. And love did not mean losing herself. So she made a decision, not out of pain, not out of disappointment, but out of wisdom. She stepped back, not completely out of his life, but out of the position she had unknowingly taken. She was no longer the one holding him. She allowed God to take that place fully, because some lessons cannot be taught by people. They must be learned in the presence of God. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to give them space to find themselves again, on their own with God. Naledi still cared. She prayed, still believed in who Kabelo could become. But now she understood her place. And there was peace in that, because she had learned something that would stay with her forever. You can love someone deeply and still choose yourself. You can care and still create boundaries. You can see potential in someone and still wait for them to walk into it on their own. And Kabelo, he had started a journey. Not because Naledi carried him there, but because for the very first time in a long time, he had taken a step himself. A small step, but a real one. And sometimes that's where healing truly begins. I want to pause here for a moment and just thank you for walking this journey with me. If this story has spoken to you in any way, Just know that you are not alone. And I want to ask you something honestly. Have you ever loved someone deeply, but realized that you needed to step back so that both of you could grow? If that's something you've experienced, I'd really love to hear your story. Tell me your name and where you're watching from in the comment section. Time passed, not in a dramatic way, but quietly. The kind of time that doesn't announce change, but slowly reveals it. Naledi had settled into a new rhythm, peaceful, grounded. She no longer checked her phone as often, no longer felt the need to reach out first, no longer carried what wasn't hers to carry. And in that space, she found something she didn't even realize she had been losing: herself. Her prayers became lighter again. Her spirit felt steady. Her joy returned, not because everything was perfect, but because she had realigned with God. And sometimes peace doesn't come from things working out the way we hoped. It comes from letting God take his rightful place again. Kabelo, on the other hand, was on a different kind of journey, a quieter one, a deeper one. There were no longer conversations anymore, no daily check-ins, just distance, intentional distance. But distance has a way of revealing truth. And in that space, Kabelo began to face himself. The things he had avoided, the wounds he had buried, the questions he had silenced, and slowly he began to do something he hadn't done in a long time. He returned, not to Naledi, but to God. One Sunday morning, Naledi found herself sitting in church. The atmosphere was calm, worship filled the room softly, and for a moment she closed her eyes, just soaking it all in. No distractions, no emotional weight, just presence. When she opened her eyes again, her gaze shifted slightly, and that's when she saw him, Kabelo, sitting a few rows ahead, still, focused, different, not completely changed, but no longer the same. Naledi didn't react immediately. She simply observed, because this moment wasn't about them. It was about what God had done in the space between them. After the service, people began to move around, greeting one another. Naledi stood up slowly as she made her way towards the exit. Their eyes met again, just like the first time, only this time it felt different. There was no curiosity, no uncertainty, just understanding. Kabelo walked over, not rushed, not hesitant, just intentional. "Hi, Naledi," he said. His voice was familiar, but steadier. "Hi, Kabelo," she replied gently. There was a brief silence, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything they had both walked through. "I've been meaning to say thank you," he said. Naledi tilted her head slightly. "For what?" she asked. He paused, then spoke honestly. "For not staying where I wasn't ready to meet you," he said. Those words landed softly but deeply. Naledi smiled, not out of pride, but out of peace. "I was never meant to replace God in your life," she said gently. Kabelo nodded. "And now I understand that," he replied. There was no need to say more, because some conversations don't need many words. They just need truth. They stood there for a moment longer. Then Kabelo spoke again. "I'm still working on myself," he said. Naledi nodded. "I know," she replied, "and that's where you need to be. No promises, no expectations, no emotional pull to go back to what was. Just clarity, respect, and growth." As they went their separate ways, Naledi felt no heaviness, no what if, no regret, only peace, because she had learned something that many people spend years trying to understand. Love is powerful, but it is not meant to save people. God is. And sometimes the most beautiful endings are not the ones where two people come back together, but the ones where both people find their way back to God separately and whole. I want to pause here for a moment and just say thank you for being a part of this story from the beginning to the end. If you've walked this journey with me, I truly appreciate you. And I want to ask you one final question. Have you ever had to let someone go, not because you didn't love them, but because you understood that their healing was a journey only they could take with God? If that's you, I'd love to hear your story. Tell me your name and where you're watching from in the comments. And if this story touched you in any way, don't forget to like, to share, and to subscribe so we can continue growing together.